Hi, I'm Tarek Asham. Welcome to the stream. You are in our pre-show where we talk about issues of the day. We'll be going live in just a few, and as always, we'll be having a post-show where we dive deeper into some of the issues we've been discussing, as well as some other topics. Ahmed and Dave Cohen are here with me again today. Great to see you both. We've been hearing some news about the abduction of a Syrian blogger. Ahmed, could you talk to us a little bit about what's happened there?
Yeah, so there's this blogger whose name's Amina Abdullah, and she obviously has a pseudonym. This is her blog. It's called A Gay Girl in Damascus, and she deems it an out Syrian lesbian's thoughts on life, the universe, and so on. So she uses poetry and other means to criticize, partly the regime, but also just she talks about topics that are taboo in Syria and in the Arab world. And there were reports that yesterday she was, 3 men in their early 20s, just while she was walking to meet a friend, kind of grabbed her, put their hand over her mouth and put her in a car, and they ushered her off. Now, her family doesn't know where she is. She's been missing for 24 hours. Presumably, they're hoping she's just been arrested. But what's interesting is that they're each taking kind of turns on her actual blog, as you can see right here. This is one of her cousins taking the time to post on her blog in her absence to try and rally support and essentially crowdsource information about her potential whereabouts.
Now, she's Syrian and American. She kind of holds dual citizenship.
That's
is that
true,
right?
yeah.
So I'm curious, there are two factors that are at play here. One is that she's an out lesbian and she's speaking about cultural taboos in Syrian society. But then the other side is that she's also been critical of the regime.
Right.
Do we know if there have been any kind of previous reprisals? Or I remember there was a note that she had been threatened before, that her father had to stand down a couple of security guys who had threatened to rape her, basically. So do we know if there's been previous issues with her because of the kind of stuff she writes about culturally, or is it more of a political thing?
Well, I really don't think this is probably a political thing. I mean, obviously in the context of what's happening in the Arab world, specifically in Syria now, she's speaking out. But in terms of was there a precedent, or has she, you have to assume that in the Arab world, if you're ever going to talk about certain subjects that are taboo, you are always going to be putting yourself out there and you make yourself somewhat vulnerable.
Yeah.
So she's obviously been aware of this, but to just take her three young men in a car, and it's worth mentioning that on the side of the car, there was a poster or a photograph of one of the, who is it? Someone in the government. I think it was actually the brother of President Bashar al-Assad's brother, who died in a car accident in the 90s.
Yeah, so I was looking at this same article. This is on our Al Jazeera main website, and they have this one quote from her that they're saying she wrote this Sunday after the violence of this weekend. She wrote about the government. They must go soon. That is all there is to say. And then she's captured on Monday evening, or at least abducted on Monday evening, which is why you wonder, maybe this is a political thing. Maybe people were paying attention to her voice. Any thoughts, Dave?
No, I mean, this is one of those things where someone looking at the outside, it just seems like, if anything, my heart sort of goes out to her and her family. It's just sort of one of those tragedies,
And when they raped her, or sorry, forgive me, when they alleged that there were allegations,
to. Yeah, her dad was able to defend her at that time.
That's quite a misspeaking right there. They were accusing her and others of being part of this larger Salafist, plot against the regime, which is a common, dismissive criticism of any sort of dissent.
And to be specific, when they speak of a Salafist plot, Salafist is a conservative Islamic movement. And this is one of the things that is so ironic to me about these kind of allegations, because she's an out lesbian blogger. How can she be a Salafist at the same time?
Well, I mean, it's definitely, the whole thing they're trying to do is to speak to the kind of narrative to invoke fear that, to the Western world, perhaps, that, this uprising in the Arab world is really an extremist movement. Well,
it's just so many layers that it actually becomes, it becomes kind of confusing to an outsider about what exactly is happening, what forces are at play, why certain things are
It's misinformation on either side. I mean, people are all trying to write their story.
It seems like there's a broader, if we take a step back, it's almost like this broader information conflict that's happening around the world. You made an interesting statement yesterday, David. I don't remember the exact quote, but it was something to the effect of, how citizen journalism is kind of the in thing. It's the thing to do these days. And it's so interesting because it's almost like everybody wants to have a voice. And so these voices are bubbling up and saying things that, maybe they didn't have the platform to say widely previously. And the more you see people doing it, the more others are inspired to do it. I'm just wondering, what do you think happens as these new voices come into increasing conflict with the powers that be?
And I think this is also a case where, you know, I could almost interpret what she's doing as not necessarily even citizen journalism, but she's just living her life online. She's living it very publicly, and it just happens to be it's an alternative lifestyle that then clashes with the powers that be. And, you know, that it just sort of goes to show that, you know, the more we learn to live our lives online, the more these kinds of clashes can happen. We have to figure out as a society, you know, just how these things reconcile.
You know, it's funny, like when I met Derek a couple years back, we were always kind of talking about blogging.
When you met David a couple years
Sorry,
back.
David, you were
I know,
Derek,
we look
David.
alike. We all look
you
the
know,
same. We all look the same.
Lots on the brain today. But no, but when I met you, you know, honestly, we were talking about blogging, and a lot of people just dismiss blogging as something that's not very significant. But you know, the bravery of some bloggers, there have been several that have been arrested in Syria. And you know, they're often accused because they have either, you know, they're blogging on a Western platform or they're using Facebook and stuff. They're often accused of being spies. And so, you know, with her being a citizen of the U.S. as well, you never know whether that plays a role
at play. Well, I'm hoping that she is returned safely. I mean, some of her family members are speculating that they think she's alive. If they wanted to kill her, they could have just done that. So hopefully they will return her. But it kind of outlines the repressive nature of some of these regimes. Now, one can speculate as to who took her, because based on the stickers that they saw in the car, people are assuming that this is some sort of government agency or people affiliated with the regime, but we don't know that for sure. And I think that's one of the challenges, particularly looking at Syria, so much of external journalism has been shut out that it's very difficult to verify what's happening in the country.
Well, you know, you rely on bloggers then, and bloggers risk, you know, like journalists, they risk their lives to report stuff.
I was, this is a random comment, but I was looking at the studio the other day, yesterday, and there's an element of the museum that shows journalists who've been killed. And I was actually staring at the wall, just looking randomly, and the first image that popped up was a friend of mine.
You're kidding?
Yeah, his name is Philippe Wamba. He was killed about a decade ago. It was unfortunately, well, it was very sad. It was a car accident, but it just makes you think about what people go through to get a story and what's happening. We hope that she'll be okay. Thanks for joining us in the pre-show. We're going to be diving into two stories that transcend the globe today, so we hope that you'll stick with us and definitely jump in with us in the post-show right here at stream.aljazeera.com, where we'll be diving a little deeper. We're going on air. We'll see you in a few. Hi, I'm Derek Ashong, and you are now in The Stream, a social media community with its own daily TV show. We're bringing you stories that are ongoing, global, and sourced from social media. Today, is Chinese microblogging looking to conquer the world? And will crowd mapping help you avoid the flu or make you more paranoid? As always, our digital producer, Ahmed Shihab Eldin, is here, and joining us on the couch for a second day is David Cohn, founder of Spot Us, an open source project promoting community-powered reporting. David, tell us a little bit about the importance of crowdfunding for your platform.
Sure. So Spot Us is a nonprofit project where we support independent reporters or news organizations. And as you can see, you can come to the site, and whereas normally, you know, people can donate to NPR or other really good nonprofit organizations, we let you decide which stories you're going to fund. So you can come to the site. Here's a specific pitch, for example, that's taking place in the Middle East, Rhymes to Revolutions, the soundtrack of Arab Spring. And as you can see, we've had 40 different people who have contributed some amount of money. We're a little bit shy of the goal, but once the reporter reaches their goal, they can go out and fund the story. The important thing here is that the community is in charge. They decide what stories we do or do not tackle.
So you're almost enabling communities to become their own news agencies. That's a really, really cool concept.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I often say, you know, you could walk into a restaurant and the waiter will tell you what to eat for dinner, but why would you do that? You'd walk right out. This is a way where you get to decide what you're going to read.
Well, there you go. Well, people tell us what they want to have for dinner, or specifically what they want to see us cover. What kind of stuff have people been talking about online, Ahmed?
Well, we have two stories today, one that was shared from Saudi Arabia and one from Turkey. And I know, David, that you are very familiar with the Ushahidi platform, which is an open source kind of crisis mapping crowdsourced mapping tool, and it's being put to use in Saudi Arabia by Rami Taibe. As you can see right here, he tweeted us, just launched fixjeddah.com, which is a base site that is based in Ushahidi to monitor pit holes, neglected garbage, all kinds of land dumps. Now, you might wonder why he built this site, which is right here, Fix Jeddah. And what the point is, he says that there's a crisis, an infrastructure crisis in Saudi Arabia, and that's not something you'd expect. You know, it's one of the richest countries in the world. And this crisis was caused in part in 2009 by a series of floods. Now, we just want to share this video that he shared with us. This is one flood in 2009. So this story is kind of underreported. You know, hundreds of people have died over the past 2 years.
That's in Jeddah?
Yeah, that's in Jeddah. So this is exacerbating what he's calling a really serious problem. And one thing that I just want to show in our correspondence, he mentioned, you can't fix something that you cannot measure, and that's why he built this map. So what do you make of that?
Well, no, I think it's actually spot on to say that you can't fix something unless you have the information about it. SpotUs has used a similar tool called SeeClickFix to map potholes in Oakland. We got 15 bikers, they all went in different directions, found the biggest potholes, and we mapped them. I'll say that the potholes weren't as bad as that flood looked, but still, you know, that was the kind of thing where then we could go in and bring it to the city officials' attention and see what we could do to fix them.
Great. Well, you know, our second story is a little bit different. It does have a polling element, not a mapping element, but we've been receiving a lot of different videos of what is being called Anonymous's now fight against Turkish internet censorship. So we're just going to play this video that was sent to us by several users and then talk to it a little bit.
Share information to the citizens of Turkey. We are anonymous. Over the last few years, we have witnessed the censorship taken by the Turkish government, such as blocking YouTube, Rapid Share, FileServe and thousands of other websites. Most recently, the government banned access to Google services. These acts of censorship are inexcusable. The internet is a platform for freedom, a place where anyone and everyone can come together, discuss topics, and share information without the fear of government interference.
So, as people have been discussing this story, we've seen, you know, in recent weeks protests in Turkey against the proposed plans for internet censorship. But people are saying, you know, that this is not really about the ruling government. So attacking the ruling government isn't going to solve the problem. They should be perhaps attacking the judiciary. This user is saying, I'm against censorship too, but blaming the government shows a lack of information. Most are by judiciary that the government is actually trying to reform.
And just to clarify for those of our viewers who are not aware, Anonymous is, it's almost like a loose collective that engages in different kinds of activities. Some of them are sort of like prankish. They do little hacks in different areas, but then some of them are very politically in nature. We remember we did a report on them a few weeks ago, which people can see on our website, talking about what they did in the wake of the WikiLeaks with shutting down sites like Visa and MasterCard, et cetera.
They've played a critical role in this Arab awakening. And one thing that we found particularly interesting is that someone tweeted at us, there's a poll that's going online in Turkey to decide which site they should hack. And this poll, as you can see here, was posted by Anonymous. They're asking, which target do we hit first? I'm going to quickly click view the results. The one that's in the lead is actually not a government website. It's the Turkish IT and Communications Institute, which is potentially, you know, the ones that are going to be responsible for any censorship. And the second one is actually the governing body in Turkey, right here. It's with 25%. It's the body that governs student exams and entrance exams in universities. So lots of interesting things being tweeted at us. And if you want to partake, if you want to share stories with us, be part of the community, you can tweet us at AJStream.
I'm Binay Bora. I'm the president of ISP Association of Nepal, and I'm in the street.
The US and China have been clashing over the internet, with Americans tossing around terms like cyber war, while the Chinese focus on what they see as information imperialism. But is a version of this conflict about to play out in the social media world? This is a story about a project called Sina Weibo. It's actually founded by a company called Sina that was created by two entrepreneurs out of Stanford back in the 90s, and it's become one of the most prominent content platforms and online ad platforms in China. A couple years ago, they started this project called Weibo, and if you look at my screen, you can see just a little clip of it. Some people will say that it's kind of Twitter-like, or it's emulating Twitter, but it's basically a microblogging platform, 140 characters, except that you can say much more in 140 Chinese characters than you can in English characters. Well, the news that's breaking today is that Sina Weibo is going to be launching in the United States. And let's take a look
So
at
what
some
does that
of
mean? It's an English language version?
so an English language, let me not say in the United
Right.
States, they're launching an English language version to target a global audience. And some of the feedback that we've been seeing online has been really interesting. UPNEPA on Twitter saying, Sina Weibo wants to launch an English version. Why would I want to put my data in the hands of the Chinese? We're also hearing another person at the Stalwart, also on Twitter, saying, other than possible novelty value, what possible reason would I have to use the stateside version of Sina Weibo? Well, some people disagree. Here's a blog post where penolson.com says, as a user of both, I assure you if it weren't for the censorship on Weibo, I'd probably never use Twitter again. Weibo is just better. Pictures, videos, and more can be uploaded directly. I want to give a little more insight because we actually had an opportunity to speak with a gentleman about this project. Bill Bishop is a writer for Business Insider, and he gave us some insight into what he thinks about Sina Weibo.
You know, say you have a business and you want to schedule some sort of a sale or an event or whatever, you can go in and you can basically say, you know, I want to do this event, and you can limit it to a certain number of people. You can put it up there, and I mean, it's a way to sort of create a sort of a social scheduling kind of functionality. Twitter doesn't have that. Anybody can go on Sina Weibo and create a poll on the fly. I can go in right now and create a poll and say, you know, hey, you know, what do you guys think of Al Jazeera? Well, the gaming channel, I mean, what they're doing there, it's not just gaming. It's also apps, applications. I mean, that's effectively where, you know, that's the Facebook model, right, where they've created a fairly open platform. They let third-party developers go in and create stuff. So yes, some of the apps are games, but then you have photo stuff. You have and there's pick a category that's on Facebook, and it's going to be on Sina Weibo as well.
Now, one of the things that we found is that Sina Weibo has also created an iPhone application. And if you take a look at my iPad right here, you can actually see a version of it. Basically, I can scroll down. We did a search for Al Jazeera, and we can actually see people looking at different, you know, points that are being made about Al Jazeera. I can blow it up in the corner. I can go here. This is one that's actually written in English. Obviously, some of them are in Chinese as well, but it's a very robust platform. And the issue now is, what are the implications of a Chinese service being launched in English when it's still has Chinese law applied to it? Right. And we know that a lot of Western companies, and particularly internet companies, have not been able to operate in China. To talk more with us about this issue, we have joining us Frances Tan. She's the Asia editor for news site TNW, the Next Web Family. Also joining us from Beijing is Kai Lukov, founder and editor of TechRice, a blog looking at all that happens on the Chinese net. Kai and Frances, thank you both for joining us. Welcome to the stream. Frances, I want to actually begin with you. Talk to us a little bit about what are the implications of Sina Weibo launching an English service. Is it a competitor to Twitter?
Well, I think it's going to be a competitor to Twitter in the sense that it is a very robust microblogging platform. But I imagine it to actually coexist with Twitter and Facebook because it is not exactly comparable to Twitter. It is more robust, but you know, being a social network, its success really relies on the social web it is able to forge. Mm-hmm. So if they're able to gather more English users, it's just gonna grow exponentially from there.
Now, I want to get Kai, your insights into this, because from what we understand, Sina Weibo has got a very significant user base, about 140 million right now. They're estimated across 200 million by the end of the year. Is it possible that they are actually simply trying to expand their existing audience to touch on English-speaking people who are interested in what's going on in China? Or do you think that this play is designed to actually be a globally competitive social network?
So I think it's more of a China plus play. I think the idea that this is going to be a head-on competitor to Twitter is ridiculous, and Sina Weibo knows it. That having been said, I'm very happy that Sina Weibo is attracting more attention internationally because I think it's at the center of some of the biggest trends in China in terms of internet and cultural and political and civil society trends as well.
So that's a really interesting point that you make there, and I actually want to ask you a follow-up on that. We've seen that some people are arguing that, well, the way in which it's used in China obviously has some kinds of restrictions, but I'd like to get the both of you to respond to another point that was raised by Bill Bishop when we spoke to him earlier, specifically about whether or not this is a closed or open platform and how we think about censorship.
There was all sorts of discussions that were quite critical of the government, quite critical of the Communist Party, stuff that I think most people outside of China or not on Weibo would assume you can never say. But in fact, Weibo has its limits, but it clearly has expanded the boundaries of what is permissible to talk about online. The government knows people feel this way and want to say this stuff, and so it's better for them to say it in a place where they can be seen and it can be monitored, but then also the government needs to know this stuff is going on, and Sina ends up being this extremely powerful sort of real-time stream of all the major issues, or most of the major issues in China at any given moment.
Now, I want to take this to you, Kai. Is it possible that Sina Weibo will be expanding the kind of dialogue that is enabled and allowed in China?
No, I think at least not for the release of its English version, if we want to term it in that sense. I think they've said that the English language version is going to abide by all of the Chinese censorship regulations, just as the current version of Sina Weibo does. But I think it is correct to point out, as Bill did, that Sina Weibo really has expanded the field of discussion for Chinese internet sites. And there are boundaries to that, but it has exposed a number of stories of local corruption, as well as just enabled certain civil society drives in terms of anti-child trafficking, or another exposure was a story in which a university student was drunk driving, hit two campus officials or hit two campus students, and his father was actually a local government official, and as the story goes, he sort of drove off and said, "Well, Basha Li Gang," so my father is Li Gang.
Yeah.
A
That
local
became
government
a
official,
viral,
which is maybe a story that you covered
that was a
previously.
huge
Exactly,
story,
and
and we did
and
cover that. We
That could
talked
not
about
have happened without Sina Weibo.
Well, we talked about the implications of that when platforms like Sina Weibo enable people to see those local injustices. I'm curious because we've heard of this term human flesh search, where people actually go online and they actually actively search for the perpetrator of crimes like that. Francis, do you think that Sina Weibo's English platform could potentially be an opportunity for people outside of China to know more about Chinese culture?
Well, I think so, but it will still be limited. I think Sina Weibo will still very much comply with the Chinese government, because after everything, it's still what they have to abide to continue operating.
We have a couple tweets coming in on this issue, and so whether it goes head-to-head with Twitter, Sina Weibo that is, we have European Muslima saying that she thinks it looks chaotic, and so from an aesthetic point of view, she might prefer the simplicity of Twitter, which, really does ring true often online, that simplicity can often trump, complexity or whatnot. We have one more tweet from LM Oliva that's just driving home the point of he thinks it's going to be interesting to see whether the censorship issue will play now that they go to an English language service potentially. And it's worth mentioning that in China, people are using this tool on a local level to talk about things that otherwise you might not get into. So people are saying it's kind of breaking boundaries in terms of censorship.
Well, I want to, before I let you both go, I want to post one last question. And that is, okay, what do you think are the implications of this English launch? What do you think will change in the social media world, either in China or overseas, based upon Sina Weibo's expansion? Kai first.
Sure. So the one good thing is that I think Sina Weibo is actually a superior product to Twitter in terms of functionality. They're in very different places. At present, I think Twitter is largely stagnant and has a very strict doctrine of minimalism. Sina Weibo, on the other hand, is in a period of just absolutely crazy experimentation, where they're trying out all kinds of different functions and trying to become much more of a social network. And I think accordingly, Sina Weibo has really capped a more mass market vein, whereas Twitter in the US, I think, has a small but influential audience. but it's nowhere near as mass market as something like Facebook.
Let me
And I
get
think
Francis
that's
in
the direction
on
that
this
Sina
same
Weibo
point
could
really quickly
potentially
before we have to go.
in China.
Thank you, Kai. Francis, how would you respond to that same issue?
Well, I'm gonna have to agree with Kai. Definitely, it's not gonna be a Twitter killer, but it really depends on how English users will adapt. Like, will blogs add a Weibo button, or will apps be developed for it that could cross post to Twitter? It really depends on the social web that it forges. And like Kai points out, really forming influential groups to go to Weibo.
Thanks to both of you for joining us. We really appreciate you being with us. David, I want to get your thoughts. First of all, I love the fact that they wore matching shirts. That's a beautiful thing.
Yes.
But just really quickly, I mean, what's your take on it?
No, I mean, you know, when you think about the strength of Twitter, it is how open it is and how easy it is to use. At the same time, I think all of us have imagined certain Twitter features that we would love to see.
Yeah.
You know, we've seen platforms, you know, Friendster was great, and then MySpace came because Friendster was sort of stalling and failing. MySpace was great, but then it was cluttered, and Facebook just streamlined it better. So it's not impossible to imagine something that is a better product replacing Twitter. But when I say better product, that includes the, you know, everything, including whether or not there's censorship on it. I mean, if there's censorship, it's not a better product.
Well, I mean, and this is a great tweet that came up from @JoshSF asking, is Twitter allowed in China?
No,
The
it ain't.
answer is no. Remember, if you want to share your stories, tweet us @AJStream. As always, we rely on you, our online community, to help keep us informed.
Hi, my name is Miriam Al Khawaja. I'm a human rights activist from Bahrain, and I'm in the stream.
Crowdsourcing, simply defined as the wisdom of the crowd, is being applied online to help people with disaster response, voting, civil rights abuses, and now it may even help you avoid the flu. A big story that's been in the news lately is this issue of health and what's happening with the E. coli outbreak in Germany. Now, I want to show you a service called Health Map. And basically, I did a search earlier that was about E. coli to see where it might be transpiring in the world. And as I looked, I see all of this activity happening in Europe. So we scroll a little bit deeper in, and we find that there are a number of pinpoints in Germany. Now, if I actually go ahead and click on one of those pinpoints, it gives me additional information about, you know, outbreak of E. coli leads to experimental treatments, the name of fear, Sina, further analysis, and soybeans are negative. It gives all kinds of information, if I were to click on one of these, about what is happening with the outbreak in those particular areas. Now, we found that there are other platforms like Google Flu Trends, where if we look at this is a flu trends in Argentina, and it's showing a map where it's saying, based upon keyword searches, Google can tell you that at such a point, there was a peak in the flu season in June in Argentina. A number of different platforms are doing this using various kinds of analytics, but the one we want to talk about today is a very interesting one. It hasn't fully launched yet. It's still in beta. It's called SickWeather. And what makes SickWeather distinctive is it actually tracks what you are saying in your various social platforms about how you feel, and uses that to map how people are doing in general. Joining us now via Skype is James Sager. He's one of the founders of SickWeather, and we want to welcome him to the stream. Thank you, James, for joining us. Tell us what distinguishes SickWeather from existing platforms that do crowd mapping on sickness.
Well, first off, thanks for having us here. I really appreciate this. So what makes us a little bit different from the other websites that are out there, we are the only ones that offer the particular combination of features that we're going to be offering. We have a much more of a social element to our service, and yeah, our platform is going to be a much more purposeful, much more user-friendly. It'll be a lot more, how do you say, it'll be a much more enjoyable user experience.
Let me ask you a question, James, because I think that we're excited to see what the platform has to offer when it's fully launched. But one of the questions that came up as we were discussing this is, what happens based upon the information that people have? You know, you have instances in various times in different places where people will have bad medical information. For example, there's currently an outbreak in the state of California, an epidemic of whooping cough, which kills little children. Why is there an epidemic? Because many people would not vaccinate their children based on false information that was distributed by a British professor beginning in the late 1990s that's been largely debunked, saying that vaccines cause autism. So if you actually look, people have mapped the incidence of rubella or whooping cough is higher in places where people were having a greater fear of these autism concerns. How does sick weather address the fact that people may not have good information?
That's kind of the nature of the social media. I mean, the social media, there is a lot of noise out there. There's a lot of information, and unfortunately, a lot of it is very informal, and it may not all be completely, researched, and may not be completely factual. But that's kind of the case with the internet.
Mm-hmm. So, David, I want to get your thoughts on this. So, you work very heavily in citizen journalism. This seems like something that could potentially be very helpful. It could potentially be really problematic. How do you address these issues of actual verity of the information that you're dealing with when you're putting out content?
Well, it's interesting, and also related, I was actually the research assistant on the book Crowdsourcing, and this is very much, I'd say, about crowdsourcing. And it's one of the interesting things is I think there are certain types of things where crowdsourcing is brilliant and actually gives you better results. So if I had a jar of jelly beans and we guessed how many, the aggregate is usually better than any individual guess. But then there are other things where you actually don't want to crowdsource. So if I'm going to have brain surgery, for example, I would much rather have a brain surgeon than just what all the viewers...
You don't want my input?
I don't want any of your input. I want a brain surgeon.
Are you saying healthcare is one of those?
Well, I'd say we're still trying to figure out, which ones are the situations where we have the jelly bean jar, where we do want everybody's opinion, or where, if I'm on a plane, again, I'd rather have a pilot than everybody who's on the plane.
Participating.
So it's one of those things that I think we need to still tease out.
Yeah. So let's get, James, I wonder your thoughts on what kind of areas is sick weather a great asset when it comes to crowd mapping sickness?
Well, as you mentioned, it's a lot more immediate. We're getting less formal data, but we're getting it much faster, and we're getting much more of it. So you have a lot of people talking about specific things like bronchitis. You have a lot of people talking about specific things like runny noses and having a common cold. In those cases, those are things that are not really diagnosed by doctors very specifically in the first place. I mean, when they send you on your way with a little bit of medication and say, oh, you just have the common cold, you're going to cough for the next few days, and then it should pass.
So your platform
Things
could
like
potentially tell us where people are having a cold or where they're having the flu. Maybe we build our travel plans around that.
Absolutely,
James, definitely appreciate you coming on. Please keep us posted when you go live. We'd love to learn more about the platform. Thanks for joining us in the stream.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Absolutely.
I'm worried about the potential for abuse. I'll just tell you, if 400 people say that in Washington, D.C. there's a polio outbreak, what's going to happen? They could just be making it up, and then people will get scared.
I also wonder about privacy.
Well, I think that's the risk. Thanks for joining us today. That's the end of our show. We're going to continue our conversation online at stream.aljazeera.com. We're going to flip the script a little bit, talking about an important story. Remember, you can tweet us at AJStream. We'll see you online. Welcome back. This is the Post Show. Thanks for joining us right here on our website. We're going to talk a little bit about something that has been in the news that is really important that we didn't have an opportunity to cover earlier, but we do want to dive a little deeper into this. Ahmed, tell us about this story that is coming out about these Palestinian activists or protesters who were actually killed by Palestinian forces.
Right, in Damascus, Syria. So near Damascus, there's a refugee camp called Yarmouk, where Palestinian refugees are there, and they feel as though in recent days they have been put in the line of fire by the PFLP General Command, as it's called. So that's the Syrian-backed PFLP.
And explain for us what PFLP stands for.
The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine.
Okay, and so the PFLP GC is backed by the Syrian government.
Yeah, and so what happened is, as you can see here, I mean, rather than, I mean, do you have the video up? Because we could just play the beginning of this video. You'll see that these are some of the refugee camp people, members of the refugee camp, and they're hiding behind here. And it seems that the actual commanders started shooting at them.
Yeah, let's not show too much of that video.
Yeah, it ends. So that's when someone gets injured right there.
Yeah.
Okay. And so essentially what happened is the general commanders opened fire on the mourners, burying these people who were partaking in the Naksa, which was, you know, another kind of day of Palestinians revolt where they tried to march to the border. So.
Yeah, so this is really sad, and we noticed there was an in-depth report on Haaretz about this.
Right.
I mean, it seems like, so initially Palestinian on Palestinian violence.
Right.
Can we talk a little bit about what motivated the protesters? Why were they protesting in this particular instance?
Yeah, well, in this particular instance, I don't think that they were protesting like the Naqsa. It happened afterwards. They were protesting the mere fact that they felt that they were drawn into the line of fire.
Yes.
So that's why they were protesting in this instance, and that's why they came under even more fire.
They felt like they were drawn into the line of fire
by their own party.
But basically that the PLFP General Command had kind of encouraged people to go to the border.
Well, no, it was during a funeral. So they were, yeah, it was during a funeral when some people have died, forgive me. And so, you know, there were a lot of slogans that were being chanted, and we even have video of the funeral right here. And so people are calling this, I mean, you know, a massacre of sorts, because the Syrian army, and we can't confirm this or not, when they came to kind of break up what was happening and what could become an even messier situation, some people are alleging that they just idly stood by and didn't really break it up.
Yeah, that they could have intervened, but that the Syrian military did not, and that's where the speculation is coming out, because the PFLP General Command is actually affiliated, as you mentioned, with the Syrian
backed
government.
by the Syrian government. So you could make an argument for complicit.
So I think this is a really interesting subject, and obviously in the wake of Obama's speech on the Middle East a couple weeks ago, in the wake of Netanyahu's visit to the U.S. and speech before AIPAC and before a joint session of Congress, a lot of people have been talking about what is the evolution of this Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but what happens when you actually see Palestinian on Palestinian violence that appears to be potentially sanctioned by another Arab government. I mean, is it just lip service when everyone talks about their interest in the Palestinian cause?
Yeah, no, and a lot of people raise that issue, you know, and they wonder where people's real true interests lie with this conflict on both sides of the borders, whether it's Syria, whether it's domestically in Palestine. This is actually an update on the story from June 6th. This is the headquarters of the PFLP GC in Khalsa in Syria. It was burnt, according to a photo, which is this photo, and this was posted on Facebook, and it's being tweeted in this instance by Pal Youth Voice. So yeah, it really does raise a lot of issues when, you know, this kind of stuff happens, these kind of altercations, and such violent ones happen, you know, in the diaspora, the refugee camps, people living in Lebanon and in Syria. So the conflict is not only fought in Palestine.
Well, David, I'm curious in your thoughts on this. I know you're not an expert on Middle East issues per se, but I mean, what do you think when you hear about these kinds of stories? Do you have any hope for resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Do I have any hope? Well, you know, the first thing that comes to mind is this is just, it's incredibly sad, right?
Yeah.
It's sort of a sad irony that they're fired on because they were protesting because they felt like they were in a weak position.
Yeah.
And, you know, I mean, I'm not that old. This has been going on my whole life, and it doesn't look like it's getting any better. You know, it just really makes me wonder, especially now with sort of this Palestinian on Palestinian. Who, you know, people have various sort of, are they just sort of being used? Are they pawns?
Yeah.
And if so, you know, what happens? They're stuck between a rock and a hard place. You know, I don't see anything. Again, I'm not an expert, but I just don't see how or where it ends.
Well, I mean, I think the term pawn really resonates when I think about this, because, you know, this is not the first time we've seen violence visited upon Palestinian refugees. I mean, the most famous incident is Shabra and Shatila, and, you know, the memories of that stuff still weighs on the hearts of a lot of people, and it's almost like, you know, it becomes a political tool to say, yes, we are pro-Palestinian, we want to support the Palestinian people, but then coming on the ground, I mean, you start to wonder about if the leadership, how the leadership even represents the interests of the people. And that arguably can be said for a lot of different countries. It's not just the PFLP that has been accused of potentially killing their own people. It just seems like such a sad thing in this critical moment when people are talking about what is the future of the peace process, that you would see this kind of violence.
And you know, and as you said, that's one tactic. You know, divide and conquer is not a new strategy. Whether it's, you know, two enemies, two foes, or, you know, an internal situation. So, you know, you had Hamas and Fatah. So it'd be interesting to see within Palestine, what happens with the reconciliation efforts there. One thing I just wanted to highlight, because I don't think we gave the proper context earlier on, is that, you know, the Naksa is not to be confused with the Nakba. The Naksa is, in Arabic, means setback. So as you can see, Palestinians were gathering, and this is what started the story. In Syria, this marked the anniversary of the day when, in 1967, you know, Palestinians had to flee. So they were protesting, and they were kind of, you know, in the Golan Heights, which is a contested piece of land, as you know. And so this is, you know, when 23 people died, this is what sparked the blog that we were talking about.
So that's what I was getting at earlier, which is that it seems that people were protesting in this latter instance in front of the PFLP General Command offices because they felt that they were drawn into, I mean, they were basically made sitting ducks. There was either they were encouraged or somehow they felt that they were put out there at the Golan Heights, at the border, where they were fired upon by IDF forces, and they didn't have any defense. And so they're going back to the PFLP and kind of saying, where were you guys?
Yeah, and just to highlight the video that we showed you at the top where the guy is hiding behind the garbage dumpster, the Arabic caption on the video, as you can see right here, it spells it out for you. It says, the members of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, General Command, opened fire on mourners burying Naksa Day martyrs. And so they were basically burying, you know, what they call martyrs, and they got fired on even while they were burying the martyrs.
So you have martyrs, people who were killed at the Golan Heights by IDF forces, Israeli Defense Forces. And then folks were protesting about it, and they were then killed by Palestinian forces in Syria.
In a refugee camp.
In a refugee camp. And I think that that sums it up in the essence of the problem, which is if you are a Palestinian living in the diaspora, if you are a refugee, if you're a person who's been displaced, who do you trust and who do you turn to?
Yeah, and you know, as David mentioned, this is an ongoing issue. Tomorrow we're going to be talking about Rafah, the border crossing with Egypt. I mentioned Egypt. But you know, we would love for people, if you have information, if you have stories to share, if you want to just be part of the conversation tomorrow, people can get in touch with us, and you could tweet us at AJStream, and you could share whatever other news you have from wherever about this topic.
So one other thing that I want to point out, and actually, David, I want to get your personal thoughts on this. You're a Jewish American.
Correct.
And you know, one of the things I remember, I went on a visit to the Museum of Tolerance in Los Angeles just, you know, I guess a month or two ago. And it was really interesting because it has a display about the Holocaust. And one of the things that it talks about is how a lot of European Jews, when things were beginning in the Holocaust, people knew what was happening, but before the Allies had formed and gotten involved, et cetera, and they were trying to flee to the United States. And people came to the border here in the United States, and they were turned away. And they felt like they had nowhere to go, which is part of the argument for Israel, because a lot of Jews feel like, look, there's no one in the world that we can turn to. We must turn to ourselves. We must have our own place. But then I'm looking at the situation of the Palestinians. I'm like, you're being fired on by the Israeli forces. You're being fired on by Palestinian forces. History repeats itself. It's like, where do you turn to? I'm just curious, when you talk to people, and obviously you can't speak for an entire community, but how do you feel when you look at this stuff, and how do you think other Jewish Americans feel when they consider this issue?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, I'm a Jewish American, but I'm actually a third-generation Californian. My family has been in America
for a long time.
In fact, my father fought in World War II. We were already in America. And so in that respect, you know, I sort of feel a connection to a diaspora myself, but not so much a country. You know, the country of Israel. And, you know, I mean, it sounds like, again, I'm a Bay Area. I feel like I'm going to say such a San Francisco cliche, you know, piece. But, you know, if there's anything that I always want, is just to sort of human beings to respect human beings. And again, it really is sad because there is a sense of history repeating itself on the flip side. At the same time, you know, I can also understand when I talk to other Jews who do feel more of a connection to Israel, where they're coming from. I mean, in the end, it's just such a sticky, you know, horrible situation. I feel like there's progress being made, especially in the sort of Middle East as a region, but it almost seems like Israel and Palestine right now is almost going backwards while the rest of the region is going forwards.
Well, it seems like there is a sort of a retrenchment, and I think that there are on both sides people who benefit from the status quo. We don't have to get too deep into that, but it seems that there are actual reasons why you don't see the peace process moving forward, and and the people wind up being the ones who lose out.
Yeah, and you know, we're gonna have Noura hopefully tomorrow to talk about all this.
Noura
Erakat, who's
Erakat.
been on the show before,
Yes.
so if you have any questions for her, you know,
She's a Palestinian activist. I'm sure she's going to have
very
a lot
involved in
of
the
stuff.
diaspora.
Some people were saying to me, like, asking, like, well, when are we going to have an Israeli guest? We actually have some people in mind, so we'll be doing that soon as well.
Yes.
And I'll say one last thing on this tip, which is that one of the things I love about this program and about this platform is that we can talk about these kinds of issues, because I feel like there's not enough dialogue that is really trying to at least consider what's at stake on both sides of the equation, and that's part of the reason why you don't have peace.
Yeah, one last thing I'm going to say is someone's been watching and he sent us that there's an update on this story, and he sent us this link on the same website, Electronic Intifada, which is apparently showing that protesters are now shouting for the downfall of political factions.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll definitely be tracking that and seeing where it goes. Thank you once again for joining us in the post show. We'll be back again at the same time tomorrow with some new topics for you. Remember, you can continue the dialogue with us online. Tweet us at AJStream. We will see you online.